This is Chapter 15, U.S. Compliance Laws, Part 2. We'll first talk about the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. And by the way, most of these federal acts, the names in them, refer to legislators from both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, that actually work together to create the act. Were the leaders of it. So the HIPAA Act, which we discussed in Part 1, is sometimes called the Kennedy-Kassebaum Act because the Democrat Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts and the Republican Nancy Kassebaum of Kansas put together that act. In this case, we have three different people. Gramm is Phil Gramm. He was a Republican senator from Texas. I think Leach, I can't remember his first name, was a Republican congressman, and Bliley was a Democrat. So this is how they come up with the names for each one of these different acts. We'll talk about Sarbanes and Oxley. Sarbanes was a Democratic senator from Maryland, and Oxley was a Republican senator from I can't remember what state, but anyway, you could look it up. So that's how these acts get their names. So let's talk about GLBA. It addresses privacy and security of consumer financial information. It is also known as the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, and it made great changes in the banking industry. Its main purpose was to allow banks, securities, and insurance companies to merge. After GLBA, these new larger corporations would have access to large amounts of consumer financial information. People feared that their privacy would suffer. To help ease that fear, Congress included privacy and security protections in GLBA. This is similar to the HIPAA rule, where both privacy and security requirements are now mandated. In concert with GLBA is the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, FFIEC, regulatory committee services the U.S. banking community. The Council is a formal interagency body responsible for defining and prescribing uniform principles, standards, and report forms for the federal examination of financial institutions by the Board of Governors. The FFIEC Council developed a cybersecurity assessment tool used to identify banks or financial institutions' cybersecurity maturity. It consists of two parts: inherent risk profile posture assessment and the cybersecurity maturity posture assessment. The FFIEC Inherent Risk Profile Posture Assessment covers the following categories: technologies and connection types, delivery channels, online mobile products and technology services, organizational characteristics, and external threats. FFIEC complements a banking or financial organization's ongoing risk management program and cybersecurity implementations. Your executive management organization must then evaluate your organization's cybersecurity maturity level for each of the following domains: cyber risk management and oversight, threat intelligence and collaboration, cybersecurity controls, external dependency management, and cyber incident management and resilience. The purpose and scope of the GLBA. Financial institutions must follow GLBA privacy and security rules to help mitigate data breaches and identity theft. GLBA requires financial institutions to protect consumers' non-public financial information, or NPI. NPI is personally identifiable financial information that a consumer gives to a financial institution. It can be in paper or electronic form. Under GLBA, NPI includes your Social Security number, financial account numbers, credit card numbers, date of birth, name, address, and phone numbers when collected with financial data, details of any transactions, or the fact that an individual is a customer of a financial institution. Here are some agencies with GLBA oversight responsibilities. The Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, oversees securities brokers and dealers, the stock market. Federal Reserve System, the Fed, oversees state-chartered member banks and bank holding companies. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, oversees state-chartered banks that aren't members of the Fed, which is almost every other bank. National Credit Union Administration, NCUA, oversees federally insured credit unions. You may be a member of one. Office of the Comptroller of Currency, OCC, oversees nationally chartered banks. Office of Thrift Supervision, OTS, oversees all nationally chartered and some state chartered banks. And then lastly, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, oversees GLBA for any financial institution that isn't regulated by any one of the other agencies. Okay, so the main requirements of the GLBA privacy rule. A financial institution may not share a consumer's NPI with non-affiliated third parties. So who is a consumer? A consumer is any person who gets a consumer financial product or service from a financial institution. A customer is a consumer who has a continuing relationship with the institution. An example of a consumer without a customer relationship is a person who withdraws cash from an ATM that doesn't belong to his or her personal bank. So if you go to another bank's ATM, you are considered to be a consumer without a customer relationship. That person is a consumer of the bank's ATM service, but he or she is not a customer of that bank. The customers must receive the financial institution privacy notices. A financial institution doesn't have to give a privacy notice to a consumer if it doesn't share the consumer's NPI with non-affiliated parties. An institution must give a customer notice of its privacy practices as soon as the customer relationship begins. A financial institution can share this information only when it first provides the consumer with a notice of its privacy practice. The notice must tell consumers about the types of data the institution collects, state how the institution uses the collected information, and describe how the institution protects a consumer's NPI. A financial institution must give their privacy notice to consumers if they plan to share the consumer with the consumer's NPI. So privacy notice must give the consumer a chance to stop the financial institution from sharing the consumer's NPI with non-affiliated third parties. This privacy rule requires you have a chance again to opt out of certain types of data. This is called the opt-out provision. The privacy notice must tell consumers how to opt out. If a consumer doesn't opt out, the financial institution can share the NPI in ways described in its privacy notice, which in a way gives a benefit to the institution because the banking institution can then just share your information. And a lot of people forget to do the opt out. So your information in a way is automatically included unless you opt out. However, the main requirements of the GLBA standard safeguards rule is to protect the security and confidentiality of customer data, to protect against threats to the security or integrity of customer data, to protect against unauthorized access to or use of customer data that could result in harm to a customer, and require a financial institution to create a written information security program. It also requires institutions to assign an employee to run the program, conduct a risk assessment to identify risks to customer information, assess current safeguards to make sure they're effective, design and implement safeguards to control risks, select service providers and make sure that contracts with them include terms to protect customer information, and review the information security program regularly to account for changes in business. GLBA oversight. Institutions that violate GLBA can be subject to both criminal and civil penalties. Monetary fines can be substantial. GLBA requires financial institutions to follow privacy and security rules. Make sure that your organization's IT systems operate in a way that complies with the law. So now we'll talk about Sarbanes-Oxley of 2002. The purpose and scope. It protects investors from financial fraud, supplements other federal securities laws. It applies to publicly traded companies that must register with the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC. These include everything from like Delta Airlines to Home Depot to Coca-Cola to Any other airline that's on the, like American Airlines is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Any publicly traded company, the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, which comes out of Chicago, or NASDAQ, requires companies to verify the accuracy of their financial information. Section 404 requires an organization's executive officers to establish, maintain, review, and report on effectiveness of the company's internal controls over financial reporting, which are called ICFR. SOX control certification requirements. A company must create, document, and test its ICFR. It must report on its ICFR every year. After a company makes its yearly report, outside auditors must review it to make sure the ICFR works. ICFR provides management with reasonable assurance that financial reports, records, and data are accurately maintained. Transactions are prepared according to accounting rules and are properly recorded. Unauthorized acquisition or use of data or assets that could affect financial statements will be prevented or detected in a timely manner. The Securities and Exchange Commission stated two broad principles in its guidance. The first is that management should assess how its internal controls prevent or detect significant deficiencies in financial statements, and management should perform a risk-based review of the effectiveness of these controls. And again, our process to provide reasonable assurance that the organization's financial reports are reliable. SOX records retention requirements. SOX requires public companies to maintain their financial audit papers for 7 years, including work papers, memoranda, correspondence, electronic records, other records created, sent, or received in connection with the audit. So working papers in an accounting firm, and when I first started my career, when I left the Army, I went to work for Arthur Andersen & Company, which is an accounting firm, although I worked in information systems design and development for them. Working papers are papers that may not be the final product of an audit, may not be the final product of some kind of construction arrangement, but maybe intermediary papers that could be handwritten, for example, but are used in creating the final product, which would be like a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement or annual accounting papers that are the final documents that are submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So working papers, memoranda, these kind of things may seem like they're innocuous or not important, but they are, and they have to be included in these financial audit papers that are kept for 7 years. And then retain the records and documentation that it uses to assess its internal controls over financial reporting. It's a crime for a person or a company to knowingly and willfully violate records retention provisions. I left Arthur Andersen a year and a half later. It was like November of 1982. Many, many, many years later, in the early 2000s, around 2001, Arthur Andersen got in trouble with the fall of Enron. They were their auditors, and they actually skirted rules and violated some of these rules and actually violated some of the laws. And as an accounting firm, Arthur Andersen was put out of business because they knowingly and willfully violated records retention provisions, as well as other provisions that were involved with the fall of Enron. SOX oversight. The Securities and Exchange Commission oversees and enforces most SOX provisions. The mission is to protect investors and maintain the integrity of the securities industry. It has 5 commissioners who serve 5-year terms and 11 regional offices in the United States. They require the Securities and Exchange Commission to review a public company's yearly and quarterly reports at least once every 3 years. Okay, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, or FERPA. And this is something that, of course, applies to you as a student at Georgia Southern University. Educational institutions can collect and store student data, demographic information, address and contact information, parental demographic information, parental address and contact information, grade information, and disciplinary information. The purpose and scope. If the school doesn't receive federal funds, it doesn't have to comply with FERPA, but even private schools receive federal funds for National Science Foundation grants, the Department of Defense grants, Department of Homeland Security grants, you name it. Um, it would be hard to think of a private college or university in the United States that doesn't receive federal money. Students that apply for federally insured student loans. So there you are. Every university does this, just about. And so consequently, it would be hard to find any university that cannot or that does not have to comply with FERPA. The primary goal is to protect the privacy of student records. It applies to written documents, computer media, video, films, photographs, includes any records maintained by an outside party acting on a school's behalf. It applies to any education agency, again, receiving federal funding. These institutions include, as I mentioned, not just four-year institutions, but community colleges, colleges and universities, four-year, primary and secondary schools, K through 12, state and local educational agencies such as the school board, schools or agencies offering a preschool program, any other educational institution that receives federal funding. FERPA is a very detailed act with many provisions. Its primary goal is to protect the privacy of student records. A student record includes any data about a student that a school keeps, which is listed there on the slide, but not limited to that kind of information. FERPA doesn't require that specific information security controls be implemented to protect student records. So it doesn't specify the technology or the hardware or the software that a college or university or any institution uses. However, system security professionals must be aware of FERPA's requirements and ensure that whatever they do is in keeping with FERPA's requirements and that whatever they employ will guarantee it. The main requirements. Students or their parents, if the student is under 18, have the following rights: to know what data are in the student's student record and the right to inspect and review that record, to request that a school correct errors in a student's record, to consent to have certain kinds of student data released. More requirements. A school must protect personally identifiable information in a student's record, such as your name, social security number, student number. A school can't release a student's record to a third party without a student's written consent. FERPA allows directory information to be disclosed without student consent as long as the student is notified. School can do this so long as it is given notice to the student. Directory information is information that is publicly available about all students, information such as a student's name, address, or telephone number. Much of this information is provided by colleges and universities in an online directory. FERPA requires schools to give students and parents an annual notice about the school's FERPA practices. This informs students about their FERPA rights. IT and information systems security professionals who work for higher education institutions must also comply with FERPA. Student privacy data includes student grades. A student can choose to forbid the release of directory information. In addition, some information may be required to be prevented from release. Probably about 12 years ago, I had a student, it must have been around 2008, who his parents were in the middle of a bitter divorce and the mother had custody. So I was told that if the father called about information regarding the student's progress or the student's grades, I was not allowed to talk to the father. The mother is the person that had the FERPA uh, waiver, I guess. And so it can get very detailed and it can get very complicated. But the father did call, and I told him that he would have to talk to the dean of students because it was not something that I was allowed to talk to him about. He was kind of upset, um, but I told him, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can tell you. So, um, in my career at Armstrong and Georgia Southern, I also have had one other situation where a student's parent called about grades, and that student had not signed the FERPA waiver, so that parent could not, because the first thing I did was check to see had the student signed it. It is a checkbox that's visible to professors, so we know what to do with it. It had not been signed, and so I told the parent that I was under no obligation to tell her anything. And I told her I'm sorry, but I hung up. And after I told her I was sorry. But yeah, so it is an important law and it does apply to you. Okay, so the oversight of FERPA. FPCO oversees FERPA compliance, has the authority to review and investigate FERPA complaints. Schools that violate FERPA can lose federal funding. Only the FPCO is allowed to sanction schools that violate FERPA. And FPCO is the Family Policy Compliance Office. Okay, let's talk about the Children's Internet Protection Act, or CIPA. The purpose and scope requires certain schools and libraries to filter offensive internet content so that anyone under 17 cannot access it. Any school or library receiving federal funding from the E-rate program must comply. CIPA defines the phrase harmful to minors as any visual picture that appeals to a prurient interest in nudity, sex, or excretion with respect to what is suitable for minors, depicts, describes, or represents sexual acts, contact, or genitalia in a patently offensive way with respect to what is suitable for minors, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value with respect to what is suitable for minors. So that last bullet point is important. Taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And that's where it gets sticky because you have to determine what is artistic or scientific value in terms of um, the information that's provided on the internet. Now, you have to understand, of course, students taking a course in biology, there probably is information that is important to that course that, taken as a whole, would have serious scientific value. So it's up to the university or the college, or in this case, K through 12 schools, to determine what is applicable and at what age level. The main requirements are covered schools and libraries must filter offensive internet content so children cannot get to it. CIPA states what must be filtered, but not how to filter it. Technology protection measure, TPM, is any technology that can block or filter the objectionable content. So in addition to the TPM, the school or library must create an internet safety policy and identify a method for addressing filtering exceptions. Schools and private libraries must adopt and enforce that internet safety policy, and the school or library must be able to disable the TPM for any adult if that adult needs to use a computer. The Federal Communications Commission has oversight for CIPA. Little oversight action is required. The FCC may require a library to refund the E-rate discount for the period of time it wasn't in compliance. Okay, so now we're going to go to something that's not a federal law, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, or PCI DSS. The purpose and scope. It assists merchants and financial institutions in understanding and implementing standards for security policies, technologies, and ongoing processes that protect their payment systems from breaches and theft of cardholder data. It helps vendors understand and implement PCI standards and requirements for ensuring secure payment solutions are properly implemented. To validate compliance, on-site PCI audit by a qualified security assessor, or QSA, quarterly vulnerability assessment scanning performed by an approved scanning vendor, ASV, and complete an annual self-assessment questionnaire, SAQ, with quarterly vulnerability assessment scanning from an approved ASV scanning company. The SAQ lists all the security control requirements that are needed for various SAQ levels. And again, this is not any kind of law. This is the PCI DSS, which if your company wants to be certified by the payment card industry DSS standards, you have to adhere to. What it would do to you if you were a company that didn't adhere to this or didn't get this like gold standard, if a customer knew that you didn't apply to it, it wasn't that you didn't follow the standards, they may not be willing to shop with you. And you may not be able to take credit cards. The PCI Data Security Standard Requirements, this is table 15-6 in chapter 15. I'll just let it sit here for a few seconds so you can read it. And the main requirements. Requirement 3.3, updated requirement to clarify that any displays of the primary access number, in other words, your 16-digit credit card number, greater than the first 6 or last 4 digits of PN requires a legitimate business need. So, you see a lot of times on your bills, just the last 4 of your credit card number. So then it would require greater than the first 6 last 4 digits of the PN requires a legitimate business need. Added guidance on common masking scenarios. Usually you see asterisks and then a hyphen, and then 4 more asterisks and a hyphen, then 4 more asterisks and a hyphen, then the last 4. And that's the guidance on common masking scenarios. That would be a masking scenario. Requirement 8.3. Expanded requirement 8.3 into sub-requirements that require multi-factor authentication for personnel with non-console administrative access and personnel with remote access to cardholder data environment, or CDE. Requirement 10.8.1, effective February 1st, 2018, a new requirement that for service providers to detect and report on failures of critical security control systems. Requirement 11.3.4.1, effective February 1st, 2018, a new requirement for service providers to perform penetration testing on segmentation controls at least every 6 months. Requirement 12.4, effective the same date, a new requirement for service providers executive management to establish responsibilities for the protection of cardholder data and a PCI DSS compliance program. And requirement 12.11.1, again effective February 1st, 2018, for service providers to perform reviews at least quarterly to confirm that personnel are following security policies and operational procedures. So making sense of these laws for information security compliance. Organizations must comply with federal laws and state laws. As a system security professional, you will possess the skills needed to make sense of these compliance laws, understand how IT systems must be configured in order to meet your organization's compliance requirements, be able to explain how these laws affect IT systems, and be able to explain the steps that your organization took to be compliant. So again, here we are, laws and information security concepts. Um, some that deal just with confidentiality, with integrity, with availability. SOX really doesn't deal with confidentiality or availability, but deals with the integrity of the securities data in terms of your stock exchange, the data of the stocks that you purchase, and so forth. Okay, lastly, we talked about what compliance is and how it's related to information security. We did an overview of U.S. compliance laws, the NIST risk management framework, and making sense of laws for information security compliance. And that concludes chapter 15.